I want to welcome you to session number 2 of our Christian Nationalism mini conference. And so in this session, we will be engaging and talking about engaging white Christian nationalism in public spaces. So building off of session 1, where we were looking really at academic study of this, we want to, in this session, begin to look beyond that and what that means for us as citizens of this country and perhaps people of faith or no faith. What does that mean overall? So again, welcome to those that were with us in session 1. And if you didn't get to join us, welcome to session 2. We will record and post both of these sessions online, so you'll be able to review those later. But I'm excited to introduce, or first, I guess, to thank you. We need to highlight some of the kind of ground rules and things that we've structured around for the Zoom session. So we do welcome your questions, and we will have a question and answer time, and we ask that you would put those using the Q&A function of Zoom. We have disabled the chat, and so the Q&A will be where you can upload questions as we continue on with our discussion. And so what I would like to do is introduce our moderator for this panel. And our moderator today is Amanda Tyler. And so Amanda is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. So based in Washington, D.C., it's an organization committed to upholding the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty for all people. So recently, the BJC launched the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. And so Amanda is uniquely equipped and situated to help lead this discussion of how we can engage white Christian nationalism from various public spaces. So thank you again, Amanda, for being here, and to our panelists for being here. I will turn it over to you to allow you to introduce our panelists, and then I will come back on towards the end once we're at the end of the session. So again, thank you, Amanda.
Oh, well, thank you, Andrew, for notably your leadership and your scholarship in this area, and also your organization at this conference. I attended, as I know many of my the panelists here today attended panel 1, and I think our takeaway from that time is that there is a lot of work to do. And so that is what we hope to address in our comments here today. As Andrew mentioned, I come to this work leading the Baptist organization BJC, which advocates for everyone's religious freedom and how we need to keep the institutions of religion and government separate in order to do that. Our work in this sphere caused us to help organize the ecumenical project, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. It's an online platform where anyone who self-identifies as a Christian can take a public stand against Christian nationalism, and anyone, regardless of your faith tradition or whether you consider yourself religious at all, can get resources on how to understand Christian nationalism and host conversations about it. And so I do want to underscore before we get started what Andrew said, that you don't have to be a Christian in order to engage on this topic of Christian nationalism. It's one of the core principles of Christians Against Christian Nationalism that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And this afternoon's panel of experienced and thoughtful advocates, faith leaders, and journalists really live this value, writing and speaking from their perspective, while always making space for people who approach religion from different perspectives. And so I am honored to help moderate this conversation, and I'm going to lead us off by just giving some short introductions of our esteemed panelists. First, we have Reverend Angela Denker. She is a Lutheran pastor and veteran journalist. She's written for many publications and routinely shares insights on religion, politics, and Christian nationalism in the U.S. for various media outlets. She's the author of the book Red State Christians: Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump. We are also joined by Jack Jenkins. Jack is an award-winning journalist and national reporter for the Religion News Service, where he covers religion and politics. Jack has written extensively on Christian nationalism and is a consistent presence at events like the Jericho March that preceded the January 6th insurrection. He's also the author of the book American Prophets: The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Next, we have Dr. Jamar Tisby. Jamar is a historian, author, and speaker. He wrote the New York Times best-selling book, The Color of Compromise, and his second book, How to Fight Racism, came out this year, the day before the January 6th insurrection. He is the founder of the Whiteness, Inc. and co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast. And finally, we have Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. He is an author and speaker, as well as the director of the School for Conversion. He serves on the steering committee of the Poor People's Campaign and is the author of a number of books, including Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion, and Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for making time for today's discussion. And so just to lead us off, I want to start in the same way that panel one did, in just giving a very short, less than a minute definition of white Christian nationalism. I think this is really important, both for people who might be joining us just for panel two today, but also because it really helps frame our conversation. And so, Angela, I'm going to start with you to lead us off on a definition, please.
Here I am. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. So the way that I would define Christian nationalism leans into my most important work as a pastor and really trying to see it through a theological lens. And that's this sense that it conflates the God of the Bible and the Jesus of the Bible with America. And so it's this sense where we're replacing our faith in God and in international inclusive faith with a very exclusive faith in America. And also I've become increasingly convinced over the past year and a half, increasing faith in whiteness and in white America.
Thank you. Jack, can you give us your definition of white Christian nationalism?
Understanding that all terms are up for debate at all times, I usually operate off of the principle that Christian nationalism is both the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation, but also importantly, that it should remain as such, that there needs to be a return to these founding principles by those who advocate for this ideology.
Jamar, what is your definition, please?
So, of course, I defer to the ones who literally wrote the book on this, Perry and Whitehead, in their book, Taking America Back for God, have some great shorthand definitions. They say it's an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic belonging and participation. But they put an asterisk by Christianity, and they say that Christian in this sense represents more of an ethno-cultural and political identity that denotes a specific constellation of religious affiliation, cultural values, race, and nationality. So I think that's a critical way of understanding it, because it's not primarily theological in the way that we might think of it. It's ethno-cultural and political in terms of identity. But I would even take it a step further, which Perry and Whitehead do as well in their book, to say, what does it look like? These are things like the American flag in the pulpit at churches. I saw on Facebook, during the Trump administration, the picture of a European-looking Jesus hovering over the White House with Trump walking into it. The massive celebrations of the 4th of July at church, almost as if it's a liturgical holiday. Those are some of the ways that I think white Christian nationalism shows up in practice, in addition to many more.
Thanks. And Jonathan, can you give us your understanding?
This is all very helpful. I think I would just add, as someone who was raised up to be a culture warrior, that when you're in it, Christian nationalism is just what the good Christian people have always believed. And I had to come to realize that the Christian nationalism that we're talking about and dealing with, in addition to all these descriptions we've heard, which are true, is a cultural product of people who want to hold on to power. It's not just some beliefs that emerged out of people's spirits and in their heads. It has been created. and it has been financed by organizations that want this culture to continue to provide a power base for the political and economic interests that they're interested in preserving. So I think that's critical to understanding how we engage it.
I find all of those understandings really helpful. It's why I like to start with that question, because we can just see how multi-layered Christian nationalism is and how it looks different from different perspectives. And I think that all of your perspectives really help that. I have one other question that's kind of for everyone to answer, and then I'll get more into specifics. And then I should have said at the beginning, we'll get to some audience questions for the second half of our conversation. And I very much hope this is a conversation that that will be organic and that will feed off of one another. But before we can talk really about confronting Christian nationalism, we have to understand it and understand its threats. And so, I'm going to start off with Jonathan and kind of go in reverse order here. If you could all kind of share with us what you view to be some of the main threats of white Christian nationalism. These could be threats to society at large, to Christianity, to adherents of other religions, to those who don't claim a religious tradition, to religious freedom for all, or to your particular sphere of influence. And, as you answer, I'd also invite you, if there's anything from the first panel that you'd really like to draw out or highlight as well, invite you to do so. So, Jonathan, if you want to lead us off in talking about what threats we should be watching out for Christian nationalism.
Well, I'm concerned about Christian nationalism because I think it's a threat to the soul. Again, I was caught up in it myself and came to understand that when you conflate this kind of ideology that's tied up with white supremacy, American supremacy, and an extreme political agenda at the moment, when you conflate that with faith, then you get into what the Bible calls idolatry, right? To turning an agenda that humans pursue into the thing that we actually honor and worship with our lives. And so I am concerned about it as a Christian and as a preacher, as a kind of idolatry that has twisted and turned the faith. For many people who are sincere believers, they're sincerely believing something that's not Christianity. And so I think the church has a responsibility to pastorally walk people towards conversion in that situation. But I'm also concerned about it, as a citizen of this country and as a citizen of the world, as I see religious nationalism. It doesn't just infect Christianity. There's religious nationalism all over the world, and it can use other religions too. And here I see it as a fundamental threat to democracy and to the kinds of goods that democracy can give us. So I said a bit earlier that I think the organizations that have created the culture behind this, it's important to know about those and pay attention to them. I've been following them closely since I wrote Revolution of Values. And one of the things I know is that they have a very clear policy agenda for this year, and it's voter suppression. And voter suppression and I should say election subversion, not just getting people not to vote, but overturning votes that they don't like if those happen to be the majority of the votes in particular states. That's a big threat to democracy. And I think it's important to realize that even when the language isn't directly connecting Christian nationalism to voter suppression and election subversion, the people who are doing it are certainly understanding that they have the support of the white Christian nationalist base as they pursue that agenda.
Jamar, I think you're next if you want to talk about some of the threats we're facing.
There's so many. Oh, my. So I have called white Christian nationalism the greatest threat to the witness of the church in the United States. That is a direct contradistinction to the erroneous falsehood lie from the pit of hell that critical race theory is the biggest threat. And we can get into that later, I'm sure. I echo what Jonathan said from a civic perspective, what white Christian nationalism does is try to consolidate and hold on to power by any means necessary, including voter suppression and election subversion. So it's a mortal threat to democracy. I also want to highlight it's a literal physical threat. We cannot overlook the fact that in order to consolidate and hold on to power, there is this condoning of force and violence. We saw this in many cases, right? In the first panel, Dr. Anthea Butler said this January 6th is not the last we've seen of it. And she's so right. It's not the first we've seen of it either. If you go back to the Unite the Right rally, so-called, right? Heather Heyer was killed by a white supremacist Nazi sympathizer. The way that white Christian nationalism allies itself with terroristic acts, with acts of violence. The most notorious white supremacist group that we know in the US, the Ku Klux Klan, envision themselves as Christian. And we can't overlook that. And then it events itself in real, literal, physical threats, especially toward people who white Christian nationalists would consider other, which would encompass anything from Black people to LGBTQ people to Jewish people. So there's that real physical threat. And then I think the subtler threat of white Christian nationalism is a ubiquity that leads to invisibility, a ubiquity that leads to invisibility, meaning for so many white Christians, white Christian nationalism isn't white Christian nationalism, it's just Christianity. It is what they've grown up with. It's what the people they've trusted, their pastors, their parents, whomever, that's what they've communicated and promulgated as the faith. So to identify white Christian nationalism and say, hey, that's not the Christianity of Christ, is to them attack the very foundations of their faith. And so that compels us to constantly name it and identify it and point it out, because otherwise people don't even see it. And that is the deadliest threat, the one that you don't even see.
Jack, what do you think about threats to white Christian nationalism?
Well, as a reporter, I'll note I have heard any number of people describe Christian nationalism as an inherent threat to a number of things. I've heard, for instance, activists and average faith leaders describe white Christian nationalism as a threat to as has already been described, the nature of Christianity itself. That's why I have heard prominent faith leaders decry Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, as a literal heresy. The strong language you can get within the Christian faith. You have also heard, people describe. I think outside of the Christian context, then Christian nationalism often seems to mirror threats that people often describe as nationalism in general, right? So the idea of an in-group, out-group of white Christian nationalists and then everybody else. Inherently, any number of scholars or activists have noted that is an inherent threat to pluralism, this idea of multiple different groups being able to fully express themselves in the same society, which is also a de facto threat to democracy, at least as we often understand it. So we've heard scholars for years argue that versions of Christian nationalism in general tend to lean themselves into the direction of coming up against our understanding of representative democracy here in the United States. And on January 6th, there's overwhelming evidence to see that a literal attack on democracy was, Christian nationalism was part and parcel of that event. I don't think you have to look very far to see that as both a existential and perhaps literal threat to democratic lawmakers and democracy itself. And so, as someone what's been interesting as a reporter for the last few years, as I attend these events, and I should mention, you noted that I'm a consistent presence at these events. That's because I'm covering them, not because I'm participating in them. As I see this really increasingly vocal subset of Americans, kind of involve themselves in Christian nationalism, I am also seeing this sort of equally vocal religious outcry against it. And it's funny how there kind of is this call and response where I'll be, at the Capitol on January 5th, talking to people, at the Jericho March who have one very specific vision of what America should be. And then I'm there 6 months later, covering the Poor People's Campaign in the exact same location, praying and singing hymns with a very different vision of what America should be. And those groups quite often, those people pushing back against Christian nationalism, describe it as both a existential and, to Jamar's point, literal threat to the faith and to their own security.
Thanks for that important clarification too about your role in the event. Angela, you want to in this question with how you view the threats?
Yeah, I want to speak first as a pastor and as a faith leader, and then secondly, as an American, as a woman, and as a mom. So first, as a pastor and as a faith leader, I would echo what some of the previous panelists talked about, which is that I see this directly as a threat to the gospel itself, that Christian nationalism is an idolatry and a threat to the gospel in much the same way as if you read the entire Bible, the threats to both in the Hebrew Bible, the threats to the God of Israel, the threats to Jesus are all rooted in an idolatrous search for worldly power and often for money. So I actually, when we were talking about this question, I pulled up Luke chapter 4, and the very first speech that Jesus gives, and he stands up and he unrolls the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And so everything that white Christian nationalism is lifting up in America is fighting against this vision of Jesus. It's fighting against good news for the poor. It's fighting against release to the captives. And, that's the gospel that I believed in so strongly that I left sports writing. I left my previous career to go and to become a minister and to fight against this culture that wants to reject much of what Jesus is saying here. So I see a very real threat to the gospel. And of course, I don't believe the gospel is going to lose, but I sure believe it's a big threat to what I believe in and what I'm fighting for. And then secondly, particular, as an American, but as a woman pastor, and as a mom, I see a very real threat of violence and a very real threat of death that comes out of Christian nationalism. Both myself having been the recipient of violent threats from people who espouse Christian nationalist beliefs. Maybe I'll get some more after this conference, we'll see. But also as someone who has watched people suffer from COVID, folks who are suffering because they didn't get vaccines, folks who are suffering because their children didn't get vaccines, people who have suffered directly because of racism. Here, I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, just a few miles from where George Floyd was murdered. So the violence that comes out of this rhetoric and the death that we've seen on a huge scale are very real threats.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of you to just show us, how varied I think the threats are, as serving in this role as both moderator, but also as an advocate on this cause. I would say amen and all of the above to everything that you all have said. And I would also add, as the leader of an organization devoted to religious freedom for all and a faith-based organization devoted to that, when people ask me what I view as the biggest threat to religious freedom, I have come to answer Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, because they think that the ideology undercuts the principles that support the freedom of every American to believe and to act on those beliefs without unnecessary interference of government, if we espouse to Christian nationalism. So I would just round out the conversation with that comment. So now I'm going to just talk specifically to each of you in your particular areas of expertise and the context of your work, and starting with you, Jack, as a reporter, you have been covering Christian nationalism for a number of years, long before we ever dreamt that it would be a term that would trend on Twitter, as it certainly has over the last several months in many different ways. And so I'm curious to know kind of how you've seen the conversation around Christian nationalism change over the last several years, and also to hear what advice you might offer to your fellow journalists who are covering religion and covering Christian nationalism about what they might look for and how they might report on it.
Sure. Thank you for this question. I should note as a caveat up front, as has been rightly pointed out to me many a time, Christian nationalism has popped up in a variety of ways throughout American history, and as a consequence, there has been ample writing about it and condemning of it, primarily by people who aren't included in its vision, right? So if the Ku Klux Klan is an overtly Christian nationalist entity, then the outgroups that people of color, non-Christians, or very particular kinds of Christians, all folks that were excluded from Christian nationalist visions in the past, have all written about this extensively throughout American history. But in its contemporary sense, for me, when I started noticing it beyond the fringes of, say, evangelicalism and some other parts of American Christian landscape, was around the time of the rise of Trump, both his campaign and then into after he was elected. And I know that there were actually some conservative writers who were some of the first people to note it in his campaign, at least in public. And then for me, I was sitting in a cabin in the woods listening to his inaugural speech in 2017 on a radio, of all things. And as I was listening to his speech, it occurred to me, like, well, this is overt Christian nationalism. Those are how those words get put together. And so that kind of launched me throughout 2017 on working on this series of pieces about this, tracking it, understanding it in the Trump era, how it has been reconfigured in the Trump era. And I thought I was particularly clever, writing about this thing that other people weren't writing about. And then, of course, Andrew Whitehead drops an email in my inbox, and it's like, not only do we know a lot about this, but we have all this data. Would you like to see it? And I was like, absolutely. And I think what has been interesting to observe over the course of the last few years is that, observations about Christian nationalism went from this thing that prior to the Trump era might have been centered on, what seemed like a more fringe element of, what is often described as the Christian right, with the religious right. Michelle Goldberg wrote a book called Kingdom Coming back in the Bush era, looking at this group as this sort of subculture. And in the Trump era, because so many of these leaders were elevated to positions of power and influence, and that the president himself was constantly invoking this, or at least in active and enthusiastic conversation with people who are unapologetic Christian nationalists, this rhetoric around Christian nationalism shifted from this thing that might be interesting to subculture people to, oh, this is what political power can look like in America in 2016, 2017, and so on. And so it started to become understood as a political bloc, as a group of people that might vote or advocate or, storm a Capitol, and in pursuit of this very specific vision for how they think America should look. And, I've seen even my fellow religion journalists start to take this concept, this ideology, this identity far more seriously, both in terms of looking for it in the American public and in the mouths of politicians, as well as just in data, as well as like looking at voting blocks and how people turn out on election day. And I will note that, unsurprisingly, the biggest spike I've seen of it going from something that people might talk about in general, or bury into the 6th or 7th paragraph of a piece, that changed a lot after January 6th, when suddenly there was a series of national conversations about this ideology and this identity. And so, I think that is something that's interesting to have observed. As to your second question about, my fellow journalists, about what to look for, I mean, in some ways, it's rather simple, right? Like it's one of those things where once you've seen it, it's hard to unsee it. And you can find it in rhetoric, you can find it in speeches. But I think it can be easy, and I think this is a problem that both religion journalists fall into, who don't want to be super salient in politics because it's not their main beat, and politics reporters can fall into who aren't super salient in religion because that's their main beat. Is that, for instance, you'll read a political article that'll just leave out the Christian nationalist sentiment that a politician delivered from a podium. And a religion reporter that'll get really into the weeds about the theology, but leave out the nationalist call that is a part of that same faith leader's sermon, for instance. And so looking for when the two overlap, I think, is one of the more valuable ways of understanding how Christian nationalism can operate as a theology and can operate as this political, rallying cry, but is perhaps most prominently observed when it is an identity, something that merges the two, that almost distances itself from theology in favor of a specific way of viewing oneself and the world. In other words, the same way we view any number of other political nationalist movements throughout human history. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think it's a serious political topic now, and one that's difficult to ignore. And frankly, something that you now see the phrase Christian nationalism, at least if not white Christian nationalism, appearing in the pages of legacy outlets today.
I think that's really helpful, Jack. And I do think that even if we've seen it in the past, having it labeled as such really helps us draw this together and help make sense of it when we do see it again. Mm-hmm. Jamar, turning to you, your professional expertise and how you come at this originally is as a historian, but I know from your writing and from your public speaking, you always turn to action. And so how can studying history help us understand white Christian nationalism? And importantly, how can it help us move into action?
So first, let me start with what may be a controversial or a provocative statement, and certainly not least because it's coming from a historian, and we're supposed to focus on describing and framing the past, not pontificating about the present. But nevertheless, the statement is this: we're living in the modern day civil rights movement. We're living in the modern day civil rights movement. Now, I think there's empirical data that reinforces this. Different polls in 2020 showed that between 15 million and 26 million people in the United States participated in some form of Black Lives Matter protests. And just by the numbers, that would eclipse the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. We've also seen important changes. Some of them are symbolic, but I don't discount symbolic changes because symbols tell stories, and stories are powerful. One of the most notable changes, certainly for me, who lives in the Delta, is that the state flag of Mississippi finally came down in 2020. Of course, it was the last state in the Union that had the Confederate emblem on its canton, and it was literally a white supremacist symbol flying above the state that has the highest proportion of Black people of any state in the Union. And that finally came down in the midst of the racial justice uprisings of 2020, after 126 years, mind you. And then also, I think it's important to note in the context of this conversation about white Christian nationalism, one of the indicators that we're in the civil rights movement of our day is not just sort of the participation or the progress, but the opposition that racial justice advocates face. And so, of course, the kind of most prominent example is the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, which was not at all disconnected from the fact that Black voters helped propel Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to the presidency, and white supremacist and white Christian nationalist forces pushing back against multiracial democratic participation like that. I'll also note, sort of highlighting something I said before about the physical threat. The Department of Homeland Security annually puts out its Homeland Threat Assessment. In the Homeland Threat Assessment, it said that domestic violent extremists, that among domestic violent extremists, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. And we are seeing a rise in these groups from the folks. They're under all kinds of names and labels and banners, but they often have this sort of Christian Protestant veneer that could be categorized as white Christian nationalism. And so when I'm talking about action, I'm talking about what Martin Luther King called the fierce urgency of now. Now, he said this in 1963 in his I Have a Dream speech. So that's almost 60 years ago, but in many ways, we need to still respond to the fierce urgency of now when it comes to racial justice. So many people say, you know, if I was alive in the 50s and 60s, I would have marched, I would have boycotted, I would have protested. To which I say, well, what you're doing right now is exactly what you would have done back then. And so it is incumbent upon us, and this breaks my heart, is the last generation of people who actually lived through the civil rights movement are passing away. So John Lewis died last year, not long before this mini conference. Bob Moses, integral leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and voting rights, especially in Mississippi, he died. So the question then is, for this generation and in the modern day civil rights movement, who's going to take up the charge? Who is going to grasp the baton and continue this race toward racial justice? And so I study history, and I study race, and I study social movements because it informs the present. But my hope, my desire is that it always moves us toward action.
Well, beautifully put, and you know, it leads me right into Jonathan, you know, that fierce urgency of now, and what a powerful voice you have as a faith-based advocate. And so just wondering, you know, what have you learned about the best way to combat white Christian nationalism, which can so often serve as an impediment to that kind of change that we're seeing calls for right now? And how do faith-based advocates, you know, including Christian advocates that reject white Christian nationalism, engage constructively in the public square in a way that can provide a really powerful counterpoint to the influence of white Christian nationalism that we see in our politics and our policy?
Well, I think it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, to recognize that this didn't just happen, that a culture was created, and that there are forces heavily invested in continuing to perpetuate that culture through, and frankly, it's important to say, you know, in the context of Christians who try to engage this, through parachurch organizations that influence people often more than their pastor or small group or Bible study do. I'm talking about Christian TV, I'm talking about Christian radio, I'm talking about these organizations that send free mailers to folks. And so all of that exists. And I would say, since she's not here today, I think Ann Nelson's work on this is critically important for anyone who wants to understand the mechanics of how this culture has been cultivated and reproduced over really the past several decades. Her book, Shadow Network, on the Council for National Policy, really lays out the organizational connections through which much of this happens. I think it's critically important to understand that. And so, given that that's the reality we face, I'm moved by that dear sister behind my brother Jamar on the wall, Sister Ella Baker from my home state of North Carolina, who understood that if you want to build culture, you build movements. If you want to build movements, you build people, and you build people in local communities. And so that's why I invest as much time as I have in the work of the Poor People's Campaign. It's the only national movement I know that's committed to challenging specifically religious nationalism. It's in the 5 interlocking injustices that the Poor People's Campaign understands to be the threat to well-being for all of us in American society. And I think it's through building an understanding where people can bring their faith into action in public life with people of the same faith, with people of other faiths, with people of no faith, but who have a common vision for how we can lift from the bottom so that everybody rises. and is committed to putting that into practice in public in a constructive way. Because I think what I would say to my fellow Christians, many of them well-meaning Christians, is that Christian nationalism ain't new. It's been around a long time. What Jamar is describing is really the backlash against the civil rights movement, which started during the civil rights movement. You know, these organizations that I'm talking about, Paul Weyrich actually established many of them in the 1970s with many of his partners and colleagues, and they have continued until today. So the reason that Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, can have influence is because it has cultural institutions. They didn't used to be as loud and as extreme as they are in public sometimes these days, and so they didn't get the same kind of attention, but that is the base. And I think their willingness to use Christian faith to sponsor lies, and I'm pretty explicit about using that term because I know these people knew they were lies. Once you've convinced people to believe lies because of their faith, at some point I think you lose control over which lies people believe. And the only thing I would add to that is that I think some people in the communities that have been most directly targeted by this campaign are beginning to see that those lies can kill them too. And I think that's one of the things we're grappling with right now, whether it's, you know, the fact of COVID denialism and then vaccine skepticism, you know, is creating real death right now in communities where Christian nationalism has really targeted, to the kinds of conspiracies that we see now that people believe because they were taught in Jesus' name to believe lies. And now they believe lies that that can literally kill people. There was a story out of a community in California this week that most of the news coverage didn't cover it as a story of Christian nationalism, but a father who killed his children, killed them because he is a Christian who in his community came to believe lies that have been perpetuated by conspiracy theory groups and QAnon and the like. But I think you have to understand the context in which Christians believe lies is a context that was created by this culture. So creating an alternative culture to that and lifting that up, letting that be very public, and convincing churches that having a public witness in that way is important, is critical to the engagement that is required in this moment.
Thank you for that. And I think it really does, you know, what inspires for me is there's so many different ways for people of faith to take a role in public life. And the principal way that many people continue to engage is in a faith community, in a specific faith community. And so, Angela, you've referenced the many different hats and different experiences you have, but one of those is of pastoring a church. And so, you know, this in my role of speaking about Christians against Christian nationalism, I often get this question about pastors engaging their congregations in understanding Christian nationalism, understanding that it's something that is present in nearly every faith community in this country. It's not something that's just in those other faith communities. And so wanted to know to hear from you, what advice you would give to pastors who are wanting to engage their congregations in a conversation about white Christian nationalism. And how can we challenge people to have difficult conversations while remaining in community with each other to try to dismantle this ideology?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate Jonathan's explicit framing of what we're up against right now is really a war against the truth, and this idea that defense of the truth, defense of the sense that there is truth, is really what we're up against as citizens and as faith leaders and as fellow human beings. And so that hits me, of course, as a journalist who entered into that profession seeking to tell the truth, and also as a pastor. So what I want to do to answer this question is to tell a story. And I have a unique experience because I live here in the city of Minneapolis, but the church that I serve, I'm their only pastor, but I drive an hour to get to my congregation. I served them part-time. We're a little Lutheran church. They built it with their own hands. They're about an hour west of the Twin Cities in a little town. And the majority of my church members are either farmers or they're factory workers. We have a big food processing plant, or else construction workers, people who really make up in many ways the base of white Christian nationalism. And so I'm pastoring in a county and in an area of Minnesota that voted over 2/3 for Donald Trump. And so what's really interesting for me is that every time that I drive out to my church, I drive from a very blue corner of Minneapolis, I'm represented by Ilhan Omar, to a very red corner of Minnesota. And so I drive from one America really to another America. And I drive on one road the whole way. And as I drive, I begin to see signs for Donald Trump more and more and more. And I remember so I want to take you back to the Sunday after January 6th. And I think like many pastors, as I watched January 6th unfold, and I was filled with fear and horror and terror in a lot of ways, I was also filled with a huge sense of responsibility of what in the world do I say? And I know for me, I wrote Red State Christians. I had this amazing opportunity to travel around the country and to really speak to conservative Christians in all different corners of America. I tried to cover a lot of breadth and depth. And I did so with a sense of hope, that there was hope for dialogue, that there was hope for understanding. And I will say that my hope in that has diminished in some ways. I've become much more cynical, and I've also become weighted with the responsibility that we must speak more explicitly, and maybe even more explicitly than I did in the book, against the roots of Christian nationalism. So I felt this weight that as I spoke to my congregation, I had to do so very clearly and concisely, and I could not mince my words about what had happened on January 6th and the role that Christianity had played in what had happened. But my other guidance for pastors is that when you feel that weight, if you feel I'm going to need to speak to my congregation on this, and especially for those of us who are serving congregations who we may really disagree with politically, broadly, I'm not saying everybody in my church, but broadly, what I would urge you to do is speak clearly and speak honestly and speak forcefully, and also speak contextually. Because what I see sometimes, what happens for a lot of pastors is we'll condemn real broadly what happened, but you'll leave your people sitting there listening like, okay, but that wasn't us. That was those other people, there was Antifa infiltrators. That doesn't have anything to do with us. We just got our Trump signs up, and that's like, we're good Americans. So what I decided on January 6th, before I even began the service, is I addressed what happened, and I addressed it by saying that if you think that you don't know anyone because of where you're situated, that this is so far away, if you think that you don't know anyone who has been a victim of the threat of right-wing Christian violence, then I want you to look at me and see that I have gotten these threats, that I have experienced this violence, and that this is personal. This isn't far away. This stretches right into our small town. And I'm not the only one. There's others among you who have been threatened and who have been victimized by right-wing white Christian nationalism. And so what I encourage them to think about real locally is to think about that for somebody like me, or for people who have been victimized by the threats of white Christian nationalism, when they drive through this little town that honestly I love the people in this town. They take care of that church. They take care of one another. One of my church members recently fell off his hay baler, and everybody came together and harvested his crops for him. There's a lot of good there. But I said, when people come through and they see those Trump signs, they don't see who you are as a town. What they see is the threat of violence against them. And I asked people in my congregation to consider what those signs might mean, even if they didn't think that that's what those signs were saying, and to consider taking those signs down in their town. So you give people something that they can do locally, like Jamar and like Jonathan are saying, that pushes towards action. and you speak really honestly and concisely about how it relates. And so yeah, I wasn't quite sure how that was received, right away. And I will say, because even when I'm real cynical and real hopeless, as I have been, lately, somehow I always get pushed back towards hope. So here's a little story of hope. One of my church leaders, he called me like a couple weeks after that sermon, and he said, the first, and so this is a guy, he's a farmer, he owns a lot of land. I've been driving by and I saw a Trump sign, and I wasn't sure if it was his land or not. And I thought, oh gosh, I hope that's not his land, but it was. So he calls me and he says, that really rubbed me the wrong way the first time I heard it. And he's like, so I watched it again. And he's like, yeah, I think it was important for us to hear. And I think it really, and then he goes, and now I'm kind of ashamed of myself because I voted for the guy. And so you got to think, okay, there's one, the conversations that you're having in your community, they're making incremental change. And we're up against, as Jonathan says, very well-funded, very powerful organizations. But I think that pastors and faith leaders in their local communities should be encouraged that when you step out, you're doing so with the Holy Spirit behind you, and you're doing so in the service of truth.
Thank you for that really poignant and specific story. I think that's really helpful. And I think I also will just say, I think that as everyone has spoken, it takes some bravery and courage to confront Christian nationalism. I think one of the big takeaways, both from panel one, but also from this conversation, is just how deeply entrenched Christian nationalism is, how pervasive it is, and how it really takes everyone working in their own spheres of influence to call it out, to understand it, to work to dismantle it, that this is something that will take many, many years and many people working in a concerted way to do something about. And so my question that I would throw out for everyone to answer before we start turning to some audience questions is, how do we work together on this? How do we pull together? I mean, obviously we do things in our particular experience and in our context, but what can we do to work together across our spheres of influence in order to confront Christian nationalism? For anyone who'd like to respond.
Let me just say one thing I love. I love what you're doing, Jamar, with the witness, because you're building culture. You've created a platform where people who are rooted in a tradition that sees through the lies of white Christian nationalism, but also has a constructive vision for what beloved community looks like, for what joy looks like, for what Christian discipleship looks like. Give those folks a platform, right? And when there's not a media outlet for the people who have that message to share, create one. That's what y'all did, and that's a beautiful thing. And now you're trying to spread that. You're trying to invest in other people who are doing that. I think that's a beautiful thing. We need to build that kind of culture that lifts up the beautiful, beautiful ways of following Jesus that exist in this society, not just somewhere else and some other time, but exists right here. Just doesn't get amplified by the media apparatus that was created to promote white Christian nationalism.
Well, that's well received, brother. I appreciate it. And I was literally, what popped in my mind first was people should access and support the Poor People's Campaign.
Indeed, you should do that too. Yes.
Yeah. So there's some good synergy there, but literally, so when I say we're in the modern day civil rights movement, if that is true, then what kind of action will it require on our part? It's going to require direct action, nonviolent protest. It's going to require marches. It has already required people getting arrested. And we should not expect that our actions today would not include actions that others have taken before in the struggle for racial justice. Now, it can expand beyond that, but I want to put that on people's radar, that this isn't just going to be hashtag activism. You're going to have to put your bodies on the line, your jobs on the line. I think the watchword for any sort of justice movement is courage. That's why I have Fannie Lou Hamer over my shoulder. I mean, she was a woman who had nothing by earthly standards. She was born with the oppression trifecta, as I call it. She was poor, she was Black, and she was a woman. Not only did she risk it all, she lost it all. The first time she went just to sign up to vote, she not only got fired, but because she was a sharecropper, she got kicked out of her home. Now, if Fannie Lou Hamer, the sort of proverbial story of the widow's mite, she had very little, but what she had, she gave. If Fannie Lou Hamer could do that, what is incumbent upon us who have far, far more in so many senses, right? And then why would justice not include us putting so much on the line? Now, the question is, how can we come together and do this? Well, number one, there are organizations doing this. So seek them out. Don't necessarily try to reinvent the wheel if others are doing good work. But if there is a gap, then I think one of the solutions is creation. You create something, you put something together. So whatever it is that you do, you write, you speak, you paint, you sing, whatever it is, bend that toward justice. So this is a call to creatives and artists of all kinds. This is a call to people wherever your sphere of influence is to make something that tells a different story and a better story. And I can go on and on and on about how we come together to fight white Christian nationalism. But I'll go back to Reverend Denker's point. So much of this, we're looking for the big thing. So much of this is happening, change happens on the micro level. And it's very unsatisfying in that sense. It's not a law passed. It's not a photo op that makes a national newspaper. It's that person who makes that Facebook comment or puts that Facebook post, and you may comment publicly or not, but if you got their number, that's the hard part. That's where courage comes in, because now it's personal and you're risking that relationship, right? It's when your pastor says, or your church member says, or your relative says, or your friend says or does something that is smacks of white Christian. Where are you going to show up in that moment? Because I ain't going to be there, most likely. There's a wall of separation because of what I look like and what I stand for, but you might be in those conversations. And how will you use that is we can get into specifics, but that's what I would say. It's a call to courage, and not just on the macro level, but the micro level as well.
Great. Well, I'm going to shift. We have a number of audience questions. So I'm going to shift now into the audience questions. The first question is about building an organized response to white Christian nationalism. The question is, what would an organized response to white Christian nationalism look like? It's not enough to simply gather Christians against Christian nationalism. Being against is a weak position. What compelling and persuasive stance should we be offering? What are we for? So I'm going to answer that specifically as it comes from Christians against Christian nationalism, but would welcome other responses about what we're for. This is something, candidly, we struggled with as we were naming it. We thought it was very important, though, to name firmly what we were against. But if you go to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, you'll see a statement of principles that is all for, something that draws people across theological difference together. And what you'll see are principles that support religious freedom for all. And so that's my short answer, is what is the best antidote to the poison of Christian nationalism? It's a commitment to the strong principles and standing up for everyone's religious freedom, and not basing someone's citizenship or someone's status in our community on what they believe or don't believe. So that's what I would answer about what we're for, but I wanted to open it up to anyone else about what the movement can be for as we combat Christian nationalism.
I think it's really important to know what Christian nationalism is for in concrete terms, right? We've mentioned it's for a limited electorate that allows for in particular in the United States, older white people to have disproportionate influence. It's for lower taxes, a smaller government, which then means fewer social programs. It's explicitly for the denial of climate science and other science now. And so when you understand that, it's the people who have interest in that and in that agenda who have backed Christian nationalism. As a Christian, I go back to the text, as Reverend Danker did for us earlier. What is the text for? What is Jesus for? What is God for? If you read it honestly, I think you got to say Jesus is for the poor. Doesn't mean he's against the rich, but he's got some hard things to say to the rich sometimes. If you're not for the poor, you're not with Jesus. If you're not for justice, for those who get marginalized, for those who get pushed to the side, you're not for Jesus. So what does that look like in public life? I think at the bare minimum, it ought to look like if people work all week long, they ought to be able to eat and feed their family, right? Ought to be able to have access to health care, ought to be able to get affordable housing in the places where they live. The Poor People's Campaign did a national study. We found there's not a single place in the United States where you can work full-time at minimum wage and rent a 2-bedroom apartment. That's sinful, because people can't live. And if people can't live, whether you're Christian or not, you can't be all that God wants you to be. So to be for that, I think, is to come together around an agenda, and then, as Christians, to read the text and understand the communities that have read the text, to say, this is what God is for. This is what it means to be Christian. So I mean, those are the people who inspire and move me, and I think that's the culture that I've been trying to encourage here. When I wrote Revolution of Values, I paid attention to communities that have been reading this text this way for a long time, and simply tried to say, there's a lot of us who got led astray by powerful forces, in some sense. It's not the sole responsibility of the people who were led astray, and yet people who've been led astray have to take responsibility for turning around, for listening to other voices, and for reading the text in new ways. I think that's how we build. We build by lifting those voices. We build by following the lead of those who understand that the gospel is for the poor and the marginalized.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in that same vein. And I remember when my first job as a pastor, I worked as a pastor in Chicago, near, large branch of Harvest Bible Church. And when people were thinking about leaving to go to Willow Creek or go to Harvest Bible Church, they'd be saying, well, I really want to go to a Bible-based church. Well, that drove me crazy, especially as a Lutheran, with this heritage of being, the Reformation movement, to put the Bible in the vernacular and help people to read the Bible for themselves. So I think reclaiming, I will say that this movement is for biblical literacy. This movement is for understanding, aligned with a movement against complementarianism that has been led by people like Kristen Dumais from the last presentation, and like Beth Ellison Barr. This movement against complementarianism, a movement towards really reclaiming the biblical texts and the liberation that they seek to bring, and who's who in the biblical texts. I remember also there was sort of a discussion going around last summer where people were saying, well, do you know there's actually no white people in the Bible? And it was like, actually, guys, there are white people in the Bible, and we're the Romans. We're the ones who crucified Jesus. So I think really understanding not only American history, but Christian history, and understanding that this movement is seeking to reclaim this buried gospel, the gospel that often gets buried, but this gospel that has played a role in America, often through Black Christians, through the civil rights movement. This gospel sense of Christianity has brought huge change to America and has brought sources of hope to America. And so I think that understanding, again, what it would really look like to have a Bible-based church, breaking down the misogyny that has enabled white Christian nationalism, is a huge piece towards re-understanding what Christian witness in America can look like. and speaking for white mainline Protestants and denominations that try to, we're shrinking. We've been shrinking for a long time. We've been crying over it for a very long time, but there's still a heck of a lot of numbers and money and institutional power within white mainline Protestantism. And I think that people need to sort of get over ourselves and move to what we still have to put that together to really fight for the gospel and fight for Christian witness, and instead of seeking to sort of maintain institutional power.
Thank you. So now I have an audience question for Jack Jenkins. The question for Jack is, how might people support journalists who are covering white Christian nationalism and telling the truth?
Well, first of all, subscribe to your local paper, encourage them to have a religion reporter. And if you see a Christian nationalism article, click on it and read it so that they get, and share it if you can. I know that sounds like a very small practical reality, but it's, journalists, we don't live in a stable profession, as it were, in terms of being able to keep our jobs. There aren't that many religion journalists in the country, full stop. And the even larger outlets don't really have, dedicated singular religion reporters who might otherwise cover that. Now, you don't have to be a religion reporter to cover Christian nationalism. You don't even have to be a religion reporter to cover religion. A good reporter can cover anything if they have enough time, energy, care, and dedication to the facts. So I say that to be like, if you see a good article, or you see a journalist who's really kind of, covering this topic in an important and interesting and revealing way, feel free to reach out and let them know that, or tell the world on Twitter, Facebook, the TikToks, whatever those things are now, and let people know that this is an important subject that people should cover. Because it's frighteningly that simple. Also, donate to any and all journalistic enterprises. But in addition to that, I will say, as a reporter, I think it's covering Christian nationalism doesn't just require covering those who might label themselves as such, although a lot of them don't, people who might fall into the category of Christian nationalism. It's also, chronicling those who are in conversation with them. That means those who are often decrying them, or those who are standing up against them. And one thing that often is the case in my profession is that you'll see a lot of people cover what Christian conservatives in general do. And it's more rare to find a lot of attention around, a variety of religious communities, Christian and non-Christian, who might be have a very different view of America or of their own faith. And so I would only add the addendum to make sure you support people who do both. There's actually a fun thing that's happened in the last few years is now, I'm sure people on this panel know about this. Like, whenever somebody mentions Christian nationalism, there'll be like this little thing on Twitter where they'll be like, oh, this person wrote about it, and this person, you got to read about this person. And then, so there's this growth of people who are writing about this topic, and they deserve support, but also support those who are talking about those who might be impacted by Christian nationalism, both negatively, whether that's, chronicling those who live within that sphere, or those who are negatively impacted by it, as well as faith communities that decry it or have alternative visions. It's, it's a long-winded way of saying support religion journalism, but I think, recognizing that it's a broad spectrum of coverage is important too.
It's really helpful and good to have some concrete things that people can do. I'm going to go to something that's less concrete, but pretty important, and a question that came up in panel 1 and that has resurfaced here. We heard in panel 1 about how white Christian nationalism often relies on a persecution narrative, it feeds into it, and then this idea of loss of privilege, what Dr. Khyati Joshi has called, white Christian privilege, right? This idea of when we see that loss of privilege, you view it almost as a loss of rights in the society, and how that combined with a persecution narrative really is a toxic combination. And so the question is, how do we provide a different narrative? How do we flip the script on that? Whether we're coming from a Christian perspective or not, and wonder if anyone can tackle, I think, what is a really difficult question that we need to address.
I always remember Vincent Harding looking at me very sincerely with loving eyes, as he always did, and asking me to consider what privilege is it really to be descended of people who claim to own other people. And in a lot of ways, that has shaped my own ministry to others who, were taught to imagine themselves as white, to interrogate the so-called privilege that we both, err when we act like it doesn't exist, right? But also when we just assume that that there's something positive that can be, used without doing the soul work necessary to address the lies that are part of that formation. So I think that's critically important from the pastoral perspective, to help people interrogate all the lies that come with imagining yourself as white in the society.
Well, we are wrapping up on our time. And so I wanted to give all of our panelists just a quick 30 seconds. Any last word you have to offer, a note of encouragement, something that you want to be sure that our group here hears before we end our time together. So just kind of open up for anyone who wants to offer.
I'll just say, if anyone was under the impression that dialogue around Christian nationalism is going away, it's not. Just over this past weekend, there was it was an anti-vaccine, anti-mask rally in Los Angeles. And I think, it made some news because there was a stabbing there. There was reports of a stabbing, as well as scuffles between some more extremist groups and some counter protesters at that rally. But if you watch some of the speakers at that rally, they repeatedly invoked Christian nationalism. One of them literally said that we need to instill the government with Christian values. It was another one quoted turning over the tables and making a whip of cords is something that people should do, to push back against vaccine mandates or mask wearing. And the thing is, that's pretty common. And I think this is a story that will continue to, if not escalate, at least continue to be a part of the American story for some time. So just continue to keep an eye out for it, whether that's from reporting from Religion News Service, but also a number of other reporters and outlets as well.
I think I would just offer some of the words that the Apostle Paul often gives in his letters to the churches, is that we cannot get stuck in being discouraged. And there's many reasons to be discouraged, but I think that if you're watching this and hearing the work of so many people here, and especially the work of Dr. Whitehead for putting all this together, there is great reason not to be discouraged. That, as we're experiencing terrible tragedy in Haiti, we're experiencing terrible loss of life and hope in Afghanistan, and also experiencing terrible tragedy around the Delta variant in the US. I think finding ways out of discouragement and into hope, and remembering that for Christians, our hope is rooted in the cross. The thing that I always noticed about my investigations of Christian nationalism and being in spaces where Christian nationalism is prevalent is that you rarely hear about the cross. It's an emblem. It's something that maybe people wear on a necklace, but you rarely hear about the cross. And so if we can reclaim the cross as the center of our faith, then we have real reason for hope, because our hope is rooted in something that looked like sure death. And we wouldn't know much about it without those first women preachers. So how about that? All right, that's it for me.
Amen, Pastor. Thank you for that. I'll just say one thing I learned from your and Sam's work, Andrew, is, when you look at the data, Christian nationalism is real, and it's a minority. but the disproportionate influence of a minority has really warped our society. And so I think that data is a kind of call to action for people who have found themselves, somewhere in the middle. They don't embrace this stuff, but they also don't really understand it, and often don't feel, like they have a clear enough understanding to speak or organize against it. I hope if you've been here today, you feel like you have something better of a grip on it and can at least join those folks who are already organizing and working to create some real alternatives. So I think that's where the hope is, inviting we are the majority, but we've been quite, I think, laid back, would maybe be the kindest way to put it in our response.
Amen. Highlight, underline everything that's been said. And all I'll say is justice is a journey, and you don't have to have the entire pathway mapped out, marked out, or understood. All you got to do is take the next right step. So don't go to sleep today before you decide on at least one thing you can do to promote a vision of the beloved community, to promote a vision of justice and equity for all people, to fight against white Christian nationalism, because you have the agency. You don't have all power, only God does, but you have some, and use that for good.
Thank you. And I will take moderator's privilege very briefly, Andrew, and give one more moment of hope that I have. Christians Against Christian Nationalism, earlier this summer, just a month ago, we released a new curriculum that churches can use to have conversations. It highlights Andrew's work and works of religious leaders and Jamar's work, and we're bringing it all together. And in a month, we've had 1,000 unique downloads. That's 1,000 communities that are ready to have a conversation. That's hopeful to me. And it's that next right step. And so I wanted to draw that resource to the group's attention, but also to offer that piece of hope and give my final gratitude to this wonderful panel for your insights and your inspiration today.
Yes, yeah, I will echo that. So thank you so much, Amanda, for moderating, and to our wonderful panel for providing insights across your various spheres of influence, and helping us all to think through what that means for a healthy democracy and body politic here in the U.S. So we do hope for those that have attended this session that you have found it useful. We thank you for taking part. Please be on the lookout for information regarding when the recordings of these sessions will be posted. You can find those on our YouTube page, and within the week they should be up there. But be sure to go and follow these wonderful panelists, follow their work as Jack is covering religion and news stories and highlighting other journalists supporting their work, and obviously with Jonathan, Angela, and Jamar, their books and the ways that they are engaging with this. And be sure to check out the BJC and Christians Against Christian Nationalism, as many other organizations are working with them to confront this and engage with it. And to check out the Center for Study of Religion, American Culture on Twitter or Facebook to stay up to date on future conferences like the biennial or online webinars like this that we call Religion and also you can find a link to a short survey in the chat, and we would ask you please fill that out. That would really help us with planning for the future and knowing what worked and perhaps what didn't. And so it only takes 2 minutes. So finally, I want to thank the Center for the Study of Religion, American Culture, especially Phil Goff and Joseph Tucker Edmonds, our directors, Lauren Chisholm and Wade Nin for their support of this online mini conference, and all of you too for attending. We look forward to future meetings, both online and in person. And again, thank you for spending some time with us today as we discuss these important issues that affect all of us, whether you're a Christian or not, or engage or embrace Christian nationalism or not. So thank you, and be well, everyone.